We do want to bring you back to some of the topics that we began seeding with you this morning when Marshall was speaking to us all about some of the crime trends and things that we've been looking at over the last few years. And specifically, we want to talk about some of the successes that have taken place with regards to recidivism reduction, but more importantly, how to take those successes in the places that have experienced them and to bring those successes to scale so that more aspects of the system can benefit from reducing recidivism, more jurisdictions, and hopefully reducing crime and improving public safety all the way around. And I'm not sure our thing is, there we go. So what we want to do over the next 10 minutes or so, going to be fairly brief before we get to the more important people on the stage, is just talk to you about basically three very key components. Now, despite what we pointed out and began to point out this morning, which was that folks who are already involved with the criminal justice system that are arrested for criminal activity, they actually comprise a fairly small share of the overall crime picture when you look at arrest activity. But nonetheless, reducing recidivism still has to be a fundamental component of any crime prevention public safety strategy. It absolutely has to be. But what we've got to know and what we've got to begin doing in our respective opportunities in the field is to take the focus that historically has been on folks coming out of prison and to apply that same focus to people who are being placed on probation in your community. So these are people who are not going to prison, they're being given an opportunity to be supervised in the community. But the focus that we've been putting on people leaving prison, that same focus of rehabilitation, helping understand what drives them, we need to do that for probation as well. And we need to adopt what works. We don't want to use the technical term that we just heard, hooey. We actually want to use programs that we know will reduce recidivism, that have a research basis to them. And then when you are doing these things, when you're scaling it up to the larger populations, when you're incorporating those practices that are supposed to work, you need to actually track what you're doing. Many of you, if not all of you, are probably familiar with the adage, you cannot manage what you don't measure. That is as true in the criminal justice system as it is in any other system. As I mentioned, a lot of states and jurisdictions around the country have been able to make marked progress in reducing recidivism. My organization that I'm proud to be a part of, the Justice Center, we put out a couple of publications over the last couple of years just touching on what some of the states and jurisdictions around the country have been able to do with respect to recidivism. For example, here's a collection of states that have reduced their reincarceration rates by double-digit percentage points. I want to be careful to point out that when we say reincarceration rates, what we're talking about is the rate at which people are returned back to prison. So these are rates reflecting people who at one point were in prison and whether or not they were returned to prison, which is not the same thing as saying whether or not they were rearrested or whether or not they were reconvicted of a crime. Very different thing. But some states do look at those additional measures. For example, Arizona, in looking at their probation population, they've also seen a double-digit decline in recidivism rate there. Texas, my home state, Michigan, they're also looking at rearrest metrics in addition to reincarceration, and they've also seen very marked improvements in those recidivism rates. And then there's yet another kind of group of measures that are not dependent on tracking a group of people over a period of time, but rather these are real-time measures. For example, here we're showing just the volume of revocations in these states. So these are people revoked to prison from supervision in any given year. They might have been on supervision for 1 month, 1 year, 3 years, but this is a real-time measure. You could look at this on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis. And the point is that it's something that's real-time in addition to those cohort-based measures. To talk about the importance of scaling your efforts and focusing on all of the populations that drive criminal activity, again, even though the focus on recidivism is but one part of your public safety strategy, it's an integral part, and you've got to make sure that that strategy applies to probationers as well as people coming out of prison. The sheer volume alone compels that kind of a focus. There are well over 2 to 3 times more people being supervised on probation in most states than there are being supervised on a form of parole. And as we'll show here in a few minutes, when you actually look at the arrest activity that people on probation are responsible for, they account for more arrests than people who are on parole. So it absolutely has to be a part of any state's public safety strategy. And finally, when you're doing these things, you've got to make sure that you're doing what works. But first, just to really kind of bring home what we're talking about in terms of the volume of the people on probation compelling the attention that I'm speaking about. So the graphic that you're looking at behind me, it shows you a couple of round circles on the left and right side of it and 2 vertical bars in the middle. What those 2 pie charts represent are, and you'll notice that they're different sizes. The one on the lower left of the screen represents the volume of people leaving prison. This happened to be in 2015, just shy of 600,000 people that left prison in that year. On the right side, that much larger blue circle, those are the 2 million people that began probation supervision during that same year. Now, the darker shaded parts on each of those circles represent their recidivism rates. Now, to be clear, this is not from one single study. That 40% recidivism rate that we're showing for parolees and the 20% rate from probationers, that's basically an amalgamation of many different studies that you could find out there. We're using these to illustrate a point, is that because of the volume of people on probation, even if their recidivism rate is half that of people who are leaving prison, you're still going to have considerably more recidivism events that those people on probation might be bringing to any community over the course of a year than will those people who were released from prison. So that sheer volume alone, even with a lower recidivism rate, means there are more instances where there's potentially a crime being committed, a person being victimized. So it is absolutely imperative to not focus solely or exclusively or mostly on people leaving prison. People being placed on probation need every bit as much attention. When you're using these things, when you're putting these efforts into place, it's really key to focus on 3 things to make sure that what you're doing is actually going to give you the chance for success. And you need to be looking at who needs what you have to offer. That's where you're assessing people, risk assessment, needs assessment. What programs are you offering and how are they being offered? And are they getting results? So you need to be looking at these programs, evaluating them, understanding if they're getting what you're paying for. And then finally, the folks that you're counting on to carry this mission out, are they trained to that mission? Do they have the skill sets to enable them to demonstrate to people that they're supervising, this is how you deal with tension, this is how you deal with stress. All of the individuals that are being supervised in these systems, we're expecting them to demonstrate new skills in their lives. It's not that much different for the people that we're asking to carry out that supervision system. We need them to understand the skills that they need to be able to model and contribute to the practices that they do in their daily jobs. So when we talk, for example, about what is needed and who needs what is on offer, we're talking about risk and needs assessment. In your workbook, you'll notice on page 45, specific to your state, that not every state actually uses risk and needs assessments that are validated. And it's important to validate them, because if you don't validate them, you don't know if they're working. And what we find is that only 20 states can tell us that they're using risk and needs assessments that have been validated on the populations that they're using them on. In terms of program quality and outcomes, the sad number on this is that 28 states report that they do not evaluate the programs, and they're also not even looking at recidivism rates to see if those programs are getting them the results that they want. Those programs are not free, so there's a cost question that is begged. And anyone in this room that sits on an appropriations committee, writes a check for correctional programs to put something in place to help reduce recidivism, this is perhaps the most important question that you can be asking. Is the money that we're spending, is what we're putting in place actually generating the kinds of results? You're not going to know that if you're not evaluating the program. And even if you are looking at recidivism results, you still have to do a more in-depth program evaluation. In terms of training your workforce, a goodly number of states, 37, indicated that in their basic officer training, they incorporate training around core correctional practices. We could spend probably 2 days talking about what that acronym stands for, but in essence, core correctional practices, those are the skill sets that you want your supervision officers using and incorporating in their day-to-day jobs. 37 states train on that in their new officer training. But in terms of refresher training, that drops down to only half of the states. It's like a doctor or a professional athlete in many ways. They have to go to the gym, they have to go to continuing education. Our supervision officers, they're no different. They need refresher training. They need to go to, quote unquote, the gym. They need to go see what the new techniques are, what the research is telling us about what is most effective. And then finally, you've got to track the various things that you're doing. Specifically, you need to look at the recidivism measures, both those that are cohort-based, where you're following a group of people either placed on a probation or released from prison, tracking them over time, seeing how they do in terms of getting rearrested, reconvicted, or reincarcerated. But you additionally need that real-time measure that looks at simply the raw volume of people being revoked from probation or parole, and you need to look at it on a regular basis. This washer dial looking image that you're looking at was really the most clever way we could think of to show how states compare to one another in terms of the variety of different measures that they track. This first one here is looking at those 3 recidivism measures related to people who are leaving prison. And what you can see is most of the states, with only a few exceptions, do track reincarceration rates for people who are leaving prison. That's that innermost shaded ring on the dial. Those outer 2 rings look at those states that track reconviction or rearrest rates for the people that they're supervising in their state. And what you can see is that there's a considerable drop-off in the number of states that track those kinds of measures. Basically, everyone is tracking reincarceration. A much smaller subset of states are looking at rearrest or reconviction for people who have been released from prison. And I talked a little bit earlier about how you need to focus efforts on probation populations as well as parole. Well, this next slide, I think, will demonstrate the point that probation populations have not been focused on quite as much. Very, very few states track in any kind of a formalized way that's regularly reported any of these rates related to their probation populations, whether it is incarceration rates for probation populations, rearrest rates, reconviction rates. So there's really a big kind of gap in knowledge in terms of what's going on with people being supervised on probation in the states around the country. Now, this doesn't mean no research has ever been done. It doesn't mean that a research department doesn't have, some 3-year-old report that they could dust off. Everyone's got a one-off, but it's not a regular feature of their criminal justice reporting. So whether you are an appropriations chairman, a director of a Department of Corrections, these are the kinds of things you should be asking both for your probation populations as well as your parole populations. Your workbook on page 38 is going to show and reflect what your state does in terms of these 3 different cohort measures for both those released from prison as well as those placed on probation. And in terms of that final real-time recidivism measure that we were talking about, only 24 states track and publish the raw volume of revocations for both people who are being revoked from probation as well as those being revoked from post-release supervision, the parole supervision. So only half of states are even tracking these real-time measures, number of people revoked this month, this year. Fairly straightforward stuff, but it's not information that's being captured and tracked in a regular way. So moving forward, again, it is absolutely critical with the understanding that reduction of recidivism has got to be one of your key components of a public safety strategy, that it not be skewed towards that population leaving prison. Keep the focus there, but make sure that the focus gets spread to include those that are on probation as well. The volume simply is too big to ignore. When you are implementing programs, make sure that they are programs that work, that they are not hooey. One of my idols is up here on this panel. And a number of years ago, I heard him talking about how you can put people in financial classes, that are on supervision or in prison, help them balance their checkbooks. Guess what you get? You get criminals that know how to balance their checkbooks. The point being that just because you're teaching somebody how to balance their checkbooks, that doesn't mean you're getting into what makes them tick. That doesn't mean you're understanding why they react the way they do in certain circumstances that have led to them committing crimes in the past. A lot of criminals are really good with numbers, by the way. So the point is, make sure it's a program that is actually demonstrated in the research to have an impact on crime and reducing recidivism, and not simply something that sounds good and feels like it should work. You need to train your workforce, you need to track all of the measures, and then most importantly, you need leadership. You've got to have leadership that keeps driving these points home and that sustains that over time, because once that focus is lost at the highest levels, it's far too easy for the focus to get lost by everybody else.